Tony and I go back now, I think, almost 20 years. And he was the one that brought me into the world of contextual behavioral science and introduced me to Steve Hayes. We've wrote our 2014 article on evolving the future towards a science of intentional change, now 10 years ago to this day. So Tony, you're one of my very biggest influences, and you're still going strong. So so happy to have you speak here and to record it. And so why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you. On that note, I will do just that. Hopefully you can see the slides. And see if this works. You see them?
Yes.
All right. Well, let me talk from them then. So I want to talk about the American healthcare system and the problems with it, and I hope that I can leave lots of time to talk about what we do about it, because this is titled "What We Can Do About It," but my answer to that is I'm not sure. We need to discuss that. So let me get started. My background is as a behavior analyst, and one of the things that I picked up in that, thanks to Steve Hayes, is functional contextualism, which, as I suspect all of you know, is a version of the philosophy of pragmatism, where the goal is prediction and influence. And originally, in the functional contextualist discussions, the focus was on the behavior of individuals, but any aspect of human functioning can be understood and can be addressed in the same way. And so a lot of my work has got me into public health and things that go beyond the behavior of individuals. And I find this framework just as relevant there. And I've taken a public health perspective, thanks largely to the research I was doing in tobacco control, where cigarettes kill millions of people, and they shouldn't smoke. And so you can try and influence individuals. But ultimately, if you're going to deal with the problem of smoking, you need to reduce the incidence and prevalence of people who are smoking. And so that kind of got me into public health. And I tend to think about most problems in terms of not only the individual person or the group, but how we can change the incidence and prevalence of the most important problems. And so that's the public health framework. It's pretty straightforward. But so the question I like to ask is, do you think our society should strive to ensure that everyone has a reasonable prospect of living a long and healthy life? And if the answer to that is yes, in your functional contextualist, the approach to affecting the incidence and prevalence of the most important aspects of well-being is what you're going to be focused on, with premature death as the most important one. And so I have increasingly found myself focused on premature death as the ultimate outcome. And the reason that that's important is because you could say, well, yeah, everybody should live a long and healthy life, but I don't care about drug abuse or crime or anything like that. Well, if you say that, I'm afraid I got you, because all of those things contribute to premature death. And so if we're going to reduce the disparities in health and well-being, we need to deal with all of these problems. So let me talk briefly about the dismal state of health in the US. Here's a chart that shows the number of premature deaths. And what you see is that the dark circles are the United States death rate. And before 1960, we had a much better lower death rate than the comparison countries. These are comparison countries are all developed countries. But as you can see, that by about 1980, that began to change, and we're now have much higher rates of premature death than most other developed countries. And in addition to the disparities between the U.S. and other countries, we have disparities within the U.S. with white men 16 years of education are living on average of 14.2 years longer than Black men with less than 12 years of education. And American Indian and Alaska Native individuals have a life expectancy lower than all other racial groups. And so what I've been particularly interested in is what we can do to reduce these kinds of disparities. So the U.S. has the most, also a criticism of this U.S. approach is that we have the most expensive healthcare system of any nation. It's about $12,000 per person. The average of other developed nations is about $6,850. And so we are spending massive amounts on healthcare. And as I've already shown you, we're not getting very good results as a result. And unlike other nations, 30% of healthcare costs in the US pay for administrative functions that are incurred by providers and insurers who are forced to contend with multiple insurance plans, each with their own rules for reimbursement and advanced approval for many services. And so we're putting much more money than other countries into simply the administration of a system that doesn't really have any impact on health. So I think about this in terms of Occam's razor, and that is the deficiencies in the American health system. Can we trace those to one factor? And I want to argue that corporations' singular focus on profit maximization is in fact the factor that accounts for the disparities. It may not account for 100% of the variance, but it accounts for enough that we should be focused on how we can change this contingency. So, selection by consequences. David has, told us that evolutionary processes are really a matter of selection by consequences, and that fits so well with behavior analysis. So we can deal with that in terms of individuals, and behavior analysts have become very good at looking at the contingencies for individuals and how it affects their behavior. And there are groups, and I think pro-social is particularly involved in trying to improve the selection of effective practices in groups and organizations. You can take this up to the level of nations, and ultimately we need to do that. But it's selection by consequences. So let's talk about the selection by consequences and the behavior of corporations. Corporations have evolved considerably in the past 200 years. Initially, corporations they hardly existed in 1800. But initially, countries and states would create corporations that enable things that would not have been possible without large extended organizations. They were particularly helpful in the development of railroads and canals and manufacturing. And the Industrial Revolution that resulted that occurred in the 19th century resulted in a large and very successful, wealthy organizations and individuals. And so we came to the point in the late 19th century, the age of the robber barons, and there was a huge proportion of people who were living in misery at the same time that there were some fabulously wealthy people. That led to a reform area in the first half of the 20th century that resulted in a large middle class. And that was a result of the progressive movement in the beginning of the 20th century, and the New Deal as well, and undoubtedly the stressors of the Depression and the Second World War brought people together in ways that they really haven't been as together as they since then. By 1970, that began to erode. There's a wonderful book by Robert Putnam called Upswing that describes this, the degree to which in the first half of the 20th century, we slowly began to be more cooperative, more bipartisan. And then, of course, starting around 1970, things changed. And that was the next point, is the evolution of capitalism in the second half of the 20th century. 1,900 bombings of businesses in 1970 in the United States. Business was reviled by a huge number of people. And that concerned, with good reason, leaders of business. And one of the results of that was that Lewis Powell wrote a memo that described the attacks on business and the danger to business and the need for people to work together. And so that was instrumental in getting a number of wealthy leaders of business to begin to organize an effort to bring about greater support for free market economics. If you read the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, you can read about the 40 years of it's up to about 50 years now, in which these organizations were created to promote the interests of the business community. So it was a stealthy effort. They set up programs in universities and they helped support organizations and so on, but they tried to kind of keep it a low profile in terms of doing these things. But they educated a generation of lawyers and created the Federalist Society. There's a lot more to be said about how the Federalist Society has contributed to the power of corporations. They supported economists. They created the Nobel Prize in Economics, which is not an original Nobel Prize. And they educated pundits. They supported Fox News. And then they educated journalists and politicians, and even Bill Clinton was embracing the free market notions. And all of these folks believed in limited government and unregulated markets, and would ensure that would ensure prosperity and freedom. And that was a vision which was very effectively advocated and moved forward in the second half, starting in the 1970 and continuing to today. So one of the key things in this was Milton Friedman's argument about profit maximization. He said there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. And I would point out, however, that during that 50-year evolution, the rules of the game changed, and they changed such that regulation was reduced, and corporations did not have contingencies that they needed to be concerned about nearly as much as they were in the first half of the 20th century. And so they could maximize their profits, and that was what they believed was basically what was needed. But there was a steady accretion of power of corporations as a result of the changes that I very briefly described. So selection by consequences. I see this. This is a graph of the 1/10 of 1%, the share of wealth of the 1/10 of 1% in the United States from 1913 to 1212. And of course, we've gone beyond that. And so if you look at this at the very bottom, 1970 or so, Powell writes his memo, this effort takes off. And what you see is that there was a steady increase in the share of wealth of that segment of the population. And I see this as selection by consequences. They tried some things, they didn't work. They tried other things, they worked. And slowly but surely, the laws changed and the profits accrued to those who had changed all of the public policies. I don't have time to go into the details of how that has happened, but let me just keep moving here. So the next thought is the impact of profit maximization in healthcare. We've got a paper that we've submitted for publication, and I told David Sloan Wilson that I wasn't as famous as he is, and I need to get these things published in places where more people will see them, because it hardly matters that 6 or 8 people agree that this is really true. We need to organize to change the situation, which is the ultimate thing if you're into prediction and influence. So there are 3 ways that corporations focus on profits and how that, and they all of which undermine health. The first is the marketing of harmful products. The second is the corporations and healthcare industry focusing on profit with little or no regard to the impact of their practices on health. But the third one is the corporate support of laws and policies that protect their profits also undermine the income and wealth of a huge swath of Americans. And which is why we have so much economic inequality. So harmful marketing, tobacco, alcohol, unhealthful food, guns, pharmaceuticals, and fossil fuels, all of which are causing and lead to more than 1 million excess deaths. We have a paper coming out in Prevention Science that documents this. We are allowing corporations to engage in these practices. I'll just say this about unhealthful food. There's a great excitement among people in the obesity realm because they have these drugs that if for, I don't know, $1,000 a month, you can get an injection and you will lose weight, and it seems to be better than anything they've had. And this drives me crazy because that says, well, we'll have the wealthy and insured be able to get these things, and we'll do nothing about the promotion of unhealthful food, which gets obesity started in childhood. And that's well documented, and nobody's doing much about it. So then there's the financialization of healthcare. And by financialization, I mean the increasing influence of financial markets, investment strategies, and profit motives on the healthcare sector. So among the things that have been going on are that private equity firms have been buying hospitals, physician practices, emergency rooms. Compared with hospitals not acquired by private equity firms, hospitals purchased by such firms experienced a 25% increase in Medicare patient adverse events after private equity acquisition. Private equity purchases of physician practices are associated with significant increases in the cost of services. And if you talk to people who are physicians, they're putting a squeeze on the physicians. It is not a good situation. Private equity firms routinely strip hospitals of assets. Nationwide, in the 2 years after a private equity takeover, hospitals have lost an average nearly 1/4 of their estate, buildings, and equipment. That's equivalent to $28 million loss per hospital. And that's basically because private equity is squeezing profits out of the companies that they take control of. Then there's health insurance, delays and unwillingness to pay for needed treatments. 30% of the healthcare costs in the US pay for administrative functions. And the profits of these corporations are twice that of other corporations. And I submit that that is because they're able to engage in practices that are highly profitable, but not necessarily beneficial to the people, and in fact are increasing their stress and their ill health. And then there are the laws that immiserate millions of Americans. This is a list of policies that don't seem to be directly relevant to, reducing the income of people or making them poor and so on. But in fact, that's exactly what it has done. Inadequate increases in the minimum wage, restriction on union organizing, monopolies that increase the cost of cell phones, internet connections, numerous other commodities, the incarceration of large proportion of Black and Hispanic males, a tax system that minimizes taxes for wealthy corporations. I can go on, but you can probably read these. The point is that all of these public policies, these are public policies that nobody seems to think are about health, but they are about health because they're increasing economic inequality, and that is a major risk factor for all of the illnesses, all of the psychological and behavioral problems that the country faces. So what can be done? Let's see. Oh, I've gotten here in time. I'm going to put out some thoughts, and I've written some things about this, but I think that this deserves study. And I think that I said to David, dear David, took me to lunch earlier this week because I happened to be in the neighborhood. And I was saying to him that I sort of, what you were trying to do in terms of studying cultural evolution is, there's a focus on at the individual level, at the group level, at the organization level. And I feel like I sort of want the franchise on, let's deal with this with respect to healthcare and the power of corporations. But then the question is, what can be done? So here are some thoughts. We need a social movement, not unlike the one in the first half of the 20th century, and not unlike the one that the wealthy conservatives did in the second half of the 20th century. But for me, the fundamental goal of such a movement would be that all corporate practices are evaluated not only in terms of their profitability, but also in terms of their impact on human well-being. So that, it's selection by consequences. But if the consequences having to do with the ill health and misery of the population are not factored into my business plan, then we're not going to affect those things. If, on the other hand, corporations become concerned that if they engage in practices that cause ill health or death, they will lose money. And you've changed the contingencies, and we can do that if we have an effective social movement. So I don't know how this is going to go over, but increase the prevalence of pro-social people, groups, and organizations. That seems to me to be sort of one of the foundational notions of what we've been talking about in terms of pro-social world. But it's all kinds of pro-social organizations that are available that could make a difference in this problem. There's the ACT movement, there's pro-social world, there's positive behavior intervention and support in schools, thousands of schools in this country, the PAC's Good Behavior Game in 50,000 classrooms, cooperative learning, the B Corps and conscious capitalism. All of these things and many other things have the values and efforts to try and improve people's well-being. And so this to me is extremely important. And if we can build from that, we may be able to bring about the kinds of changes that we need. However, I want to ask this question: how likely is it that we will influence the values and practices of the large, well-funded, and influential corporations that are devoted to profit maximization? I'm fearful that we may very well bring about changes in the values of many of those corporations, but I think I think we need something more. We can't bank on pro-sociality becoming the leading, the main focus of society without a lot of additional work. So here's a list of conservative corporate hegemony. I mean, this is a list. These are all organizations that have tons of money. They're spending tons of money. I mean, we just saw today that Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world, said, no, the Washington Post will not endorse a candidate for the president. Well, what's that about? Anyway, so there are all these organizations. So we have to, in some way, counter the influence of these organizations. In every case, each of these entities faces reduced profits if the reforms we seek are achieved. Their practices are shaped and maintained by the profits that result from the laws and policies they've achieved over the past 50 years. And those practices include all the lobbying and electioneering that they do. And as Upton Sinclair said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. So we have much work to do. And so let me see if I can get, I can't see this. No. I'm trying to see the top of the slide. I can read it.
Yeah, I know it. That's irritating.
This is what happens when you have a tiny computer. It is unquestionably the case that pro-social groups are essential for bringing about the change we need. But as Lewis Powell said, strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. I think that's a pretty good summary of what we need to be doing. So here are some social movements we could look at and learn, and perhaps we could come up with a strategic plan for what could be done. And we need funding. And so on that note, well, there's something about messaging here. We need to put people before profits. That's a good slogan. But we need to document that we need to document this for every sector of society to show how profit maximization has corrupted each sector of society. There's a fair amount of that in my book, Rebooting Capitalism. But what I think is needed is that we get a group of people in major universities, in programs that are funded to see how we can, so that we're educating the next generation to understand these issues and to be motivated to try to rein in the excesses that are due to profit maximization. So we can build a network of advocates for people before profits, just as the business community has done over the last 50 years. Yeah, okay, I will shut up. Tell me how we're going to do this.
Hey. Thank you, Tony.
Actually,
Jeffrey, help us.
Well, thank you for your comprehensive presentation, Tony. I'm afraid, but I'm kind of amazed that we have such a small intergroup group, because this message needs to go to a much broader group of people. But as the only doctor in the room, as you know, Tony, I'd like to Socratically dialogue with you. And I will say that most of my colleagues who are doctors are on the liberal side, progressive side, and have been saying absolutely everything you said for the last 40 years, including the questions you ask about what to do. So therefore, I have an exponential amount of frustration compared to you. I would make two revisions to your worldview. You mischaracterized insurance companies. Insurance companies declare their profit as the amount of net income they have compared to their premiums. Now, if you imagine banks declared their profit compared to the net number of money they have in deposits, they would be markedly understating their profit percent, because the money in deposit is not really theirs. In the same way, the insurance money that collects, the insurance companies that collect premiums, the premium is not their product. Paying out, doing business is their product, but they compare their profit to their premium income. So they have snowed you and everybody else. Their net income is really on the order of 20% or so.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. Number two, you like to use the tobacco model, but the tobacco model did not depend on information about how cigarettes cause lung cancer and heart attacks. It depended on civil liability lawsuits to the manufacturers. And everybody knows that, because that's why Congress passed laws eliminating the possibility of civil liability for gun manufacturers. So I would say that in response to your discussion, that what you call pro-social, I call social capital because I like Robert Putnam's paradigm. And I would say that when you mentioned Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post abandoning its editorial responsibility, I think we've already passed the tipping point. And the catastrophic has happened. Your chart on wealth in the 0.1% only stopped in 2013. We've gone a decade since then, and they probably have closer to 40 to 50% of all wealth.
Right.
As Bezos and Elon Musk show us, they are now bigger than countries, and we're their serfs. So I think we need to start with a serf attitude, and I don't mean people that like the ocean, and go from there.
Well, okay, so let's hear from other people about this.
So if I could speak up, I'm a physician also, geriatric neurologist. I agree with your assessment, and think there are a couple of things we should do. We need to look for points of leverage where the existing system is exaggerating the promises of a profit-driven healthcare system to extreme. And I'm going to single out my own field of Alzheimer's disease as such an example. Whether it's corrupt scientists or regulatory capture or false promises and expectations from the National Alzheimer's Association, for example, it's a field that is showing us that over-medicalization of the processes of aging and the processes of brain function are just failing. So that's my one point. My second point I'll make more quickly. When we human beings are frustrated by our inability to think through the complex challenges, for example, of the health consequences of the climate change, we have to recognize we have a very powerful ally, which I'll frame metaphorically as Mother Nature. There will be the beginning of collapse. There is the beginning of collapse. Jim Bandel think it starts in 2016, but whenever it does, collapse is going to occur, and we have to find a way to ally the principles that are so important to understanding Mother Nature in service of Mother Nature's lessons that she's trying to teach us about health. And I think, so looking for points of leverage like chronic disease, like Alzheimer's disease, and tracking what is happening to health because of climate, I think are two areas for us to focus our attention.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Others?
Well, I'll go. Obviously, I have a lot to say. So the question is, in some ways, how to compress it. One is, I mean, to get the history of this right, I think, Tony, you were joined by quite a few other people, including Peter Turchin. And so if you look at Peter Turchin's work, his newest book on end times, it's all about collapse. His previous book on American history, Ages of Discord, and many other books, I think, are telling the story that this is the second Gilded Age. The first Gilded Age came so near to collapse that that leaders such as FDR realized that they really had to start governing on behalf of the whole nation rather than on the part of their elite class. And one of the books about FDR is titled Traitor to His Class. And so, you know, his fellow elites turned on him for his policies. And well, a story from that book is that when he was elected president, he said, I'm either going to be the best president in US history, or I'm going to be the last president in US history. So basically staring into the abyss and then realizing, now part of what's needed is a powerful alternative narrative. And that's paradigmatically different, and so we could really reveal the immorality of it, because this is partially normative, and to come up with a paradigm that's a genuine alternative to what today is the neoclassical paradigm. But if you run this back, one of the things that I've discovered is that this tug of war goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And if you read about John Stuart Mill or the beginning of economics, if you see what Thorstein Veblen and his times are, this has been the tug of war. The whole roots of neoclassical economics was, in the first place, it claimed the scientific high ground because it seemed what to be scientific, a physics of social behavior. But in the second place, it justified the status quo. And basically, its message is that the current distribution of wealth is fair. And then against that, you had other people, and especially the evolutionary worldview at that time, which Thorstein Veblen represented, was saying, no, not at all. I mean, our current institutions are not God-given. They were different in the past, can be different in the future, and the current distribution of wealth is profoundly unfair. That was Veblen's thesis. So fast forward to the present, and we have like the same wine in new bottles, and the same issues being discussed. Although this time around, I think that, and then one of the things we are doing, not just what can we be doing, but what are we doing, is we are articulating and catalyzing the communication of this powerful new paradigm and what it means. And so the evolution / complexity paradigm, I think the more that gets articulated and spread, then the more it captures the intellectual high ground. And then the argument for neoclassical economics just becomes weaker and weaker. And that's part of the solution, not all of the solution by any means, but part of the solution. Another thing, as you said, is we need to get support. And this needs to be, I mean, it's actually remarkable what we're doing on almost no money, but we're still punching way above our weight. What would it be like if we actually had something like the INET or the Mercatus Center or the Powell Memo, as you said, the Mont Pelerin Society, that we really did have more funds to work with, not just financial capital, but that too. And that's possible. That's possible. There's a lot of progressive rich people out there. And so, but then also it needs to be organized. And I'll make this my last piece for the moment. Because if you look at INET as an example of a very wealthy person who invested a lot of money in new economic thinking, and at the end of the day, it came to so much less than you might want. And the reason for that is that there was not a really integrated alternative paradigm. It's what Dennis Snower and I call diffuse pluralism, 1,000 critiques which do not cohere with each other. And so on the one hand, we have this integrative framework, which has been so durable and which justifies this extreme inequality. And on the other hand, you have 1,000 critiques that don't cohere. And only now do you have a critique which does cohere. Cohere is very powerful. That's where we are. And so I think these are some grounds for optimism and for what we're basically in the thick of. And of course, we welcome your participation. You wanted that to be your franchise, as you said. Yeah, we definitely need to work together.
Well, I think one of the things that comes to mind when you say that is that very few people are talking about this in terms of profit maximization being the root cause of the problems we have. Hal, it's your turn.
They're muted, I think.
You mentioned the Mercatus Center. That is David Koch owned, basically. He created it. You can read a book called Democracy in Chains about the intellectual tradition, heritage of that economist named Buchanan, who was very, very clever in creating ideas that appealed to intellectuals, and at the same time, he was really a total outright racist. And then they
Mm.
brought on Tyler Cohen to elevate the Mercatus Center, and people in Silicon, my Silicon Valley friends love Tyler Cohen, but he got David Koch's attention by writing a book to prove that there is no such thing as a market failure. And we have to get to we have to, I don't know, spread ideas. We have to get ordinary people interested in knowledge again.
Mhm.
And through doing that, and along with changing the structure so as to make democracy work again. I tell you, I think that I've said this before. I think to some of you, I think that the ranked choice voting, which is basically instant runoff, which means that a person's got to get a majority and before they can be elected president. They have to get a majority after eliminating the lowest ranked person and then the lowest ranked person after that and so forth.
Right.
You
Yeah.
can't get a majority on those terms, you can't be elected. That the state of Maine went to that after they had a disastrous three-way election in which the person that people hated the most became governor, and they decided they have to put in a system so that doesn't happen again. I don't think Donald Trump would have gotten through the primaries if the Republican primaries, if they had been run on as kind of instant runoff system. And some Republican primary systems have been run on ranked choice voting. In Virginia did that for a while. I don't know if they're still doing it, but it's getting some traction, and it's something that can be grown from the ground up. Unlike changing the electoral college, you'll never get the electoral college changed in the current atmosphere. You can't get, the Republicans are controlling the state legislatures. It's just a mammoth thing to do. The last time we tried to do a big amendment was the Equal Rights Amendment.
Mhm.
And we've all grown old since that happened.
Well, it's sort of what you're saying is comes back to what David was saying, and we have a plethora of theories, but we need to bring people together around
Yeah.
one effective position or theory.
Yeah.
Jim,
Well, just to this little group, Braver Angels just had a yearly convention where they had 1,400 people, and they started out 4 years ago with getting like 20 quote red people and 20 blue
Right.
people in a room for a weekend, talking and getting to respect each other.
Yes. Well, I want to be sure that everybody gets a chance to talk. So,
Okay,
Jim, you've got your hand up.
I'll take it down.
I'm also a physician. I've been working on this, Tony, for 40 years. And,
We need the
Turn up
sound
the
is
volume.
low.
let somebody else talk before.
Who else? I'll call on you if you don't volunteer. Kathleen Walsh, would you have any input on this?
Well, I have ideas, of course. I'm a retired mental health person, so I don't have a strong background in economics or even business, but I've been following these issues for many years because at one point in my career, I recognized that it was business and it was the conditions of the economy that was driving so much of mental health problems. And, some people have heard this before, but, I've said I felt like an enabler helping people cope with a system that was inherently
Right.
toxic and making them sick. I really loved your presentation. Yeah, it's hard for people to talk about profit maximization being a bad thing because people in the U.S. especially are so acculturated to the idea that equivalence, there's that underlying, Protestant ethic. If you have a lot of money, you must be a good person, and this is, the divine reward. But there are other models, and I liked what David said about there has to be a new narrative, and there has to be influential leadership talking about things like Kate Raworth's donut economics and the limits of the major domains of resources that we all share, both humanity and with all living things. And profit maximization is curtailed or redirected with redistribution through taxes, which of course is really hard for people to talk about effectively here, but it does work. It does work effectively in other countries, industrialized countries. So, having a narrative that captures people's attention and can bring them together is the hard part. But maybe climate change, or maybe the fact that people are suffering, or maybe the fact that they're not going to be able to get insurance for their homes. The next time it's flooded, they won't have a home. Those things, I mean, it's kind of like the medical model. Once people are
Right.
sickened, then they'll seek treatment.
Well, one of the things David and I found ourselves agreeing on the other day is that whoever wins this election, the kind of thing we're talking about here is going to be needed. So somebody else want to talk? We're recording this, and I think maybe Lauren and I will pull it all together and get back to you. If you're interested in the possibility of participating in a group that would, systematically try to, articulate what that would look like, what a movement would look like, you can email me at Tony, TONY, @ori.org, and we can take a shot at it. Let's see.
Tony, I could say something.
Yeah.
This is sort of in the interest of thinking about the coherent narrative idea.
Yes.
I've been reading, as someone mentioned, Jem Bendel's work. I've been reading the book Breaking Together recently, and chapter 10 in that book focuses on the monetary system and the way that the way we've structured money is kind of underpins profit maximization. It leads to an inevitable force for growth. And so even people who are in charge of corporations may well feel trapped, as they do by corporations law, but also just by the very structure of money.
And what's the book?
It's called Breaking Together by Jem Bendel. It's basically coming from a collapse perspective, that collapse is inevitable, and how do we decline gracefully, as it were,
Right.
collapse together rather than apart. But I'm interested in whether you've explored and thought about the way that money inevitably, at least the way we've developed money, it drives for growth. There must be inevitable growth to support
Right.
any institution as well as individuals. Because one of the reasons why I'm saying this, I wasn't going to say it because it doesn't really lead us towards solutions or anything, but one of the reasons I'm saying is I think we've got to be really careful. Much as I agree with you about the evil forces that are aligned and the ways that they've set it up, we're never going to find an answer through othering of evil corporations or even evil people. We need to at least understand the systemic forces that are driving them as well, aside from just assuming there's raw selfishness. I'm sure that's part of it, but I don't think that's all of it. Thank
I
you.
agree. I'll add to that when it's my turn, but I think Jeffrey, you're next.
Oh, if you'll let me.
And then we have Jim. Jim, is your
Yeah.
sound back now?
Yes, I
Uh,
think it is.
Good. Okay, Jim, go next.
So in terms of othering, I would suggest to Tony that corrupt in the title of this talk is the wrong word, because that both others and accuses. It's really the natural function of the current system that's dysfunctional, and it's not corrupt. It's according to longstanding social and cultural memes. The second thing I would say is I do go back to Putnam's Bowling Alone. And at the time when it was written, which is in 2000, it was quite clear that he was talking about a civic vacuum. And his book was all about the trends in America, which really started in 1950, Tony, according to his data, which destroyed and petered out what he called social capital, which was the ability of people to work together. And contemporaneously, I was talking about the fact that we needed an institution to step into that vacuum and predicted that it would be the church. And in fact, over the last 20 years, evangelical Christianity, with its mega churches and then its manipulation toward fundamental Christianity, whatever that is, stepped in and filled the vacuum. And so if you don't other the other people but understand their values, you see that they came to life and maturity in a world that was becoming disassembled or lot focused or losing its collectivity. And the church provided a vehicle to that, which then I could diplomatically say was energized and manipulated for profit and power. But nonetheless, that's the mechanism. And one has to recognize the value of that evolution of the church into the vacuum. And when you talk about creating a movement, you have to think of a broad-based civic social coherence, which will substitute, if you will, for Protestantism, Catholicism, and the shulls, and attract people and give them functionality for their family, for their children, and for their future. So that is trying to be a constructive comment.
Thank you. Jim.
So Tony, I'm a physician. I've been working this for 40 years. The critique misses something critical. It's not that it's false. It's just that there's so many good people working in healthcare with their
Yes.
heart and their soul. And they are being negatively impacted, as you say, by the financialization, burnout, the overwork. And yet the case has to speak to those good-hearted people also, and the tremendous good that our healthcare system does. It helps people walk, repairs limbs, prevents disease. So the critique has to be balanced to be believable, because I've been working with the critics for 40 years, and they are on the outside of the system, and it's important that the system stays terrible so that their critique stays powerful. And I've been a manager in public hospitals for 40 years, and few people want to step in and say, can we improve this system? They'd much rather be safe and be a critic and say it's terrible, it's no good, etc. That's one comment. The other comment is those many organizations working on this amounts to what I think David calls the balkanization of this work, the archipelago, that everybody's working in their own silo. And I work in homelessness now. It's exactly the critique of the homeless organization. They mean well, they work hard, they do good, and they don't collaborate sufficiently. So how can we consciously evolve these separate organizations doing good to evolve into a unified aim of improving this society, improving our community. It's a standard evolutionary challenge, multi-level selection. But we have to balance the interests of the individuals, organizations, and people with the collective aim of improving our society. And I just not in your book and in your critique, I don't see that. And I think we need that to resonate with the heart of people. They want to be working on something heartworthy and resonant with their values. And I think it's possible, but I don't see that in your slides, in your critique. So that I think might be an improvement.
I think that, and some others have mentioned othering. I think that's a very valid and helpful. So because there's a sense in which what's pro-sociality about? All those organizations that I was talking about, all of them are trying to help people to be more caring and loving and so on. So that's good feedback, and I will make use of it. Kathleen?
Well, just briefly, I appreciate what Jim Schlosser was saying, but nobody's saying that the people in healthcare are responsible for fixing this particular system, that there's profit maximization that's driving ill health in other sectors. But radical ideas like guaranteed income, they don't get any traction. There was a wonderful physician here. I live in Portland. I think he was up in Seattle or Washington, Stephen Bezrushka. He was an emergency room physician that compiled statistics for years on income inequality and the relationship between income inequality and the rising prevalence of all kinds of social ills, physical, mental, environmental degradation. And there are people that have been advocating for other kinds of solutions that are positive and aren't about othering. And I personally think that guaranteed minimum income is one of them. And wealth redistribution through taxation is another. It's just a question of what's the narrative that's going to catch people's attention, so that some kind of movement that has a lot of people that kind of identify with something positive and agree to identify with other people and build up over time. And so I think the positive outcomes of addressing having other services or different services, or addressing some of these social problems in other ways, has got to be articulated by influential leaders. It's just not happening yet.
That's very helpful. We're past the hour, so maybe David's going to bring this all together, and we'll already all know what to do.
In a sense, first of all, I want to really praise the comments, the tenor of the comments that have been coming through. So they've been very helpful and constructive. And including the idea that this is a systems level problem, and it requires a systems level solution. And there's a sense in which it's not helpful to demonize particular people. So I think that's, a very valuable thing to be able to say. And Tony, you invited people, if you want to say more, get in touch with you, but no, please. That's part of working together. Is that this is the conversation that needs to be taking place in a much broader audience. And I do think that Pro-Social World has become a hub, a very important hub for this. So I would invite this conversation to take place within the boundaries of Pro-Social World, and for you to join that conversation, Tony. So let me say that. And as an illustration of this, I want to return to the Mercatus Center, and just by coincidence, I attended their annual conference not 2 weeks ago, Markets and Societies, and I think that the description that Hal, I think that you gave at the Mercatus Center was a little bit othering in its own right, and I think that if you look hard at this particular society, including Buchanan, you mentioned him. Other heroes of them are Friedrich Hayek, who was very different than Friedman, and Eleanor Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom is like a major, major, major figure in that crowd. And what they're saying, and I think really what they have said for a long time, is that there's something different than either markets or states. If you think that only markets or only states, that's dichotomous thinking. But there's an entire world out there which is neither markets nor states. And it has to do with just myriad different kinds of institutions and nonprofits and so on and so forth. And lots of stuff is best done in that sector, neither markets nor states. And that leads me to my final point, which is I think that if you take the concept of polycentric governance seriously, which they do and which we do, it means that a lot of the solutions to these problems do exist at intermediate scales. And so we actually have lots of positive examples to, in the first place, to learn from, and in the second place, to generalize, which is precisely what we're doing. And on homelessness, Jim, I think you'll agree, we have examples such as Roseanne Haggerty's, your neighbor, Community Solutions, which really does take a systemic approach to the problem. It's called Built for Zero, in which you bring together all the stakeholders in a particular region, and then you train that system which you've organized on each and every homeless individual, and so to understand their context and to solve their problem. And so there's one of many examples of things done right, that if you can first of all make them visible, and one way to make them visible is to make them theoretically coherent, because currently you have to unlearn everything you learned in business school in order just to see them. That's precisely what we're doing. And so I think that actually there's a lot of hope in what we're doing. And Tony, I would just invite you, as you have, basically, you've never been apart from this community. I would just, as we try to do still more together, then please let us do it, not just through Pro-Social World. Pro-Social World is a hub, and hubs by definition have spokes to other organizations. That's my concluding remarks. But
well, we've talked a little bit about fundraising to support this, and we'll keep at that. Maybe Jeff gets the last word.
I have a Zen comment. Tony said something about investing in positive life and life opportunities. And there is clearly good documentation that investing in life at the earliest ages has the most return on investment. That's point number one. Tony, you may know this, but most people here won't. My only responsibility in the healthcare world these days is dealing with child homicides due to abuse and neglect. And my Zen message is there is now a new national organization, I believe it's called Let Them Live, which is focused only on reducing mainly on reducing child fatalities due to abuse and neglect, which, for your information, are more common than child deaths due to cancer. And that organization is funded, Zen moment, by the American Enterprise Institute.
right, good illustration, basically, good illustration.
All right.
All right, everyone. So this has been great, and it's been recorded. And so I think that we're energized. I'm energized to build upon what we've already add to what we've already built. So all good. Thanks so much for your presence, and we continue.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks,
Tony.
Tony. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.